it in the chat.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we should get started. Welcome to everyone who is joining us today. I am Lara Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Leadership Education Network. Welcome to our September PLENtalk. I am so glad to be joined today by Dr. Lara Brown, who is a good friend of PLEN and has been super supportive of this organization. And she's the director of the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. And GSPM has been just a great partner for PLEN over the last few years, and we've really enjoyed working with them and putting on joint programs. And really glad that when people there do cool things like write a book, we can help support them. So I'm so glad to welcome Lara, who is also on PLEN's advisory council. And so she's just been great and has had lots of great advice for PLEN. So Lara, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. So I want to, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't know if you want to do sort of a welcome and a little information about PLEN, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me and doing this. And it is true that I love PLEN. I think it's so important for women to engage in politics and policy and our process. The truth of the matter is we are finally starting to have the numbers of women engaged in the process that we should have had all along. So it is exciting to see that after 100 years of having the vote, we are now really starting to kind of make the breakthroughs at the participation and leadership level that we have. So I welcome all of your students and audience members, and man, politics, stay with it. It's a crazy world, but it is well worth your time.
Yeah. And thanks. That actually, so one of the things that Lara always says when she greets our students who come to our seminars here in DC, now virtually, to learn about careers in policy, is how much patience it takes to kind of, you win some, you lose some, but you sort of, the process, like you said, is so important. And that's part of the kind of beauty and pain of politics, I think. And that actually is a really good segue into kind of your book, because I think, you have this historical perspective of leadership at the presidency. And I wanted to kind of, the way this is going to work is I'll kind of ask you some questions. We can kind of have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So I want to start by just asking, what prompted you to write this book? Why this? Why now?
Yeah, well, first, let me just show the cover. So for those of you who can't see the cover, I'm hopeful that you can. You'll see that this is actually a picture of President Trump looking a little bit downward at his notes at a podium. It's something of a close-up, and behind it, you can see the portrait of Abraham Lincoln. This is actually a photograph that was taken by Doug Mills, is a photographer for the New York Times. He has covered the White House for decades. And I thought that this picture really described, to a certain extent, where we are in our modern era. That when we think about our great presidents like Abraham Lincoln, and then we look at, our more modern presidents, which obviously includes Donald Trump, there is this sense of, really, how did we get here? How did we go from where we were to where we are? We had many higher expectations for what the president should be like, what the role demanded, and who was the type of occupant who should fill that office. We're now in a very, very different place. So that's sort of the personal public side of why I wrote this book. I also wrote this book because I'm a political scientist by training. And I wrote a book in 2010 where I looked at all of the presidential campaigns in history from 1796 up through 2008. And what was fascinating to me was I was trying to understand the type of candidate that tends to run for the office and win the office. And when I looked at those candidates, what I found was that by and large, most were inordinately ambitious. They were wildly off the charts in terms of their own ambition. And they were also what I called highly opportunistic. They were people who could see opportunities in environments and turn them to their advantage and capitalize on that either electorally or within their party or around some demographic. So they were also kind of savvy and creative and flexible. And not all of being an opportunist is bad. I mean, right, entrepreneurs are opportunists. And so these politicians really did have a lot of traits like that. But it also occurred to me as I wrote that book and in the 10 years since I wrote that book, that there is this problem with having people who are continually opportunistic hold the office of the presidency. Because what it meant was that they were going to continually remake the presidency in their image. And I wanted very much to kind of look at the presidency itself, how essentially those characters behave once they're in it, and see if we could understand what really differentiated some of the better ones from some of the worst ones. And also maybe how it has changed in the modern era since Jimmy Carter, when the nomination process itself fundamentally changed the nature of who won.
Great. So talk a little bit about that. How has presidential leadership changed over time? Are there traits that you found that have stayed consistent since the beginning? Since America was founded, are there things that have changed?
Well, certainly. I mean, this is what's so interesting is that every person who runs for the presidency is wildly ambitious, but there is a difference in terms of how their ambition was constrained by norms or the culture. So one of the things that's happened over time is that in the early republic, being ambitious was not thought to be a positive thing. It was actually thought to be something kind of repugnant. So most of the presidents, even when they were running and serving, they used to talk about the burden of public service. They used to talk about how hard it was. And they really worked hard to show that they were public servants rather than personally ambitious for the achievement. And that has really changed over time. Anyone who says to us, oh no, I don't really want to be president, we sort of like go, right, okay, then why did you go to New Hampshire and Iowa? Why did you, we kind of reveal their ambition. And over time, that ambition has become more and more naked. I mean, just evident and obvious to all Americans and to themselves. And part of the problem with that, I think, is that that means that ambition is less about serving and more about serving oneself. So that has certainly changed over time. Mm-hmm. It's also true that the other big change in terms of their opportunism is that most of these people in our past history had incredible experience in politics. Even if they hadn't held offices, they had been deeply involved in their political parties. They had been kind of engaged in the policy debate, in the political debate, kind of writ large, right? And if they hadn't done politics, they had been military generals, right? So they had risked their life for the country during a time of war, whether we're talking about Eisenhower or William Henry Harrison, right? These folks were generals who didn't have a lot of political experience, but knew politics because they knew the military and they knew war. Again, right, in the modern era, since Jimmy Carter and since 1976, we have shunned both kind of political experience and even military experience, partly because the Vietnam War was not seen as a positive war that the United States, an honorable one that people had engaged in. So it didn't matter if people had shirked their duty to serve. We sort of forgave that, whether we're talking about George W. Bush or Bill Clinton. Both of them, found ways to manage the draft. And then certainly in the most recent era, I mean, Donald Trump is well known for getting out of service in Vietnam by having a doctor's note that said he had bone spurs, right? So, and Donald Trump is even more unusual than all of our other presidents since Jimmy Carter in that he also didn't have any political experience. So those are kind of the two big ways in which we understand people's kind of lens or vantage point on politics and on the office prior to their serving. And then of course there are individual traits, which we can get into.
Right. Are there, so speaking of those traits, are there things, obviously context matters, kind of what's going on in the world matters, but are there traits, sort of personality or certain traits that you found made someone more likely to get elected again or kind of to be a good president?
Well, so this is what's really interesting. One of the things I argue in my book, I don't believe that we can understand people's motivations. So even though this is a query about character and at some level psychology, I'm not a psychologist. So I can't get into their head and understand their motivations. I very much take, a different perspective, and it's the perspective of essentially George Washington that says actions are the manifestation of character. So I believe that who you are is what you do, right? So if you say you want to write a book and you are never writing, then really you don't want to write a book. Okay, I mean,
Right.
like there are these kind of things that we can just look at people and we can say, look, what you're doing is actually who you are. And it speaks more to your intentions than in fact, whatever you say you're doing. So what I did was I analyzed these presidents' leadership styles. I looked at their actions prior to the presidency on 3 different dimensions. And then I looked at how they led during their presidency. So for instance, I believe that there are basically 3 dimensions on which people can lead. You can either lead with essentially curiosity, which means that you can have a conversation with those people who work for you about, you know what, I think we really need to investigate this matter. I think we need to do more analysis. We need to dig deeper into whatever issue it is. And for presidents and for governors and mayors, most of the time, that kind of query or that kind of leading with curiosity often leads to them forming a commission, right? They form commissions to look at the issues. They bring in experts to talk to them about what is the important knowledge that they should know before they make a decision. So that's one dimension of leadership, leading with curiosity. There's another dimension of leadership that I consider to be leading with courage. And leading with courage is really just about taking an action or taking some kind of risk and doing it usually fairly quickly and decisively, and continuing to execute in that manner. I think kind of the most stereotypical way we think of leadership, you know, that it's all sort of about strength and courage, or, you know, jumping into the crossfire on the battlefield. But that's certainly not the only way. It's one dimension. And then the third dimension that I looked at is really, I think, a very key dimension, and it kind of fits with what we understand to be emotional intelligence, right? I talk about leading with compassion. And leading with compassion is really a whole other set of actions. Quite frankly, when one leads with compassion, they don't usually do much, but they listen a lot. They hear, you know, like it's about this idea of hearing and kind of reflecting back what you hear. It's about a sense of emotive concern and a realization that maybe if you even don't understand, you can have empathy for another. And so I sort of jokingly refer to these dimensions as being the Wizard of Oz, right? It's really the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. Right? And you as a leader, as Dorothy, if you can essentially deploy your friends in the way that you want, you'll make it to Oz, right? Because there are different kinds of dimensions of leadership, and a good leader is actually able to be flexible, read the situation, know what is needed at the time, and then is able to do those things.
That's interesting. Is there anything that surprised you in your research?
Yes. So one of the things that surprised me was actually two things, and they were both about George H.W. Bush. So Bush Sr. I was college age in 1992. So I was, 22 years old that year. That was really one of the first years I deeply engaged in politics. I had obviously kind of been awoken to politics during my college years. That was the year, 1991 was when we saw Anita Hill and the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearing. It's also true that we had racial strife and riots within Los Angeles. I was going to school in LA in 1992. I was at UCLA. So I kind of came into that year, and it was also the case that we were coming out of a recession. And I came into that year sort of believing that George H.W. Bush was as passive as he appeared in that campaign. That he was not a very decisive leader, that he was not a very sort of sympathetic or empathetic individual, that he was sort of cold and elitist and, far removed from what the needs were of that time. Now, of course, I was, 22 years old, but this is where memory and history are always really fascinating, because when you dig into the history, sometimes it really upsets your memories, right? It makes you realize you didn't know anything. And I really didn't know anything. And what I actually found when I investigated George H.W. Bush's life, his political career, and in fact, his presidency, was that he was sort of his kind of what I would consider to be characteristic temperament, actually very courageous. He was taking risks all the time. When he was a kid, he used to just jump out of trees. He loved like jumping out of trees, right? And later in life, no surprise, he's like in his 80s and he's jumping out of airplanes, right? I had sort of had familiarity with his experience as a war hero when his plane had been shot down, but I didn't really know much about it. I had come to really be like impressed by that whole series of events, his life in that perspective. It's true that I would not have pegged that his second most kind of comfortable leadership style was actually with emotion, with a sense of compassion. And in fact, that he was somebody who was sort of always connecting with people at that heart level rather than the head level. And that surprised me. Because again, you know, I had heard about the fact that when he went to the grocery store, he didn't know what the scanner was. And that supposedly meant that he was out of touch and a little clueless. So that I would definitely say he was kind of the most surprising to me.
Interesting. No, it's so interesting that you talk about memory and kind of the way that that plays into like memory versus facts. And I mean, it just made me think of a lot of my own biases that probably exist. So I want to ask one last question, and then we can kind of open it up for a few minutes. But so both candidates right now, Trump and Biden, have said that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Do you agree with that? Can we endure the kind of character and leadership of more presidents like Donald Trump without, you know, that don't have that? I mean, I guess now he has 4 years of experience, but kind of what do you, if you had a crystal ball, what would you kind of see?
So let me talk a little bit about the trend in this modern era.
Yeah.
So the trend in this modern era, post LBJ and Vietnam, post Richard Nixon and Watergate, we have to remember that Johnson and Nixon were two of the most experienced presidents we had ever had. And they significantly and substantially disillusioned the country on their decision-making within Washington. They were seen as liars, right? That Johnson had sort of downplayed the severity of the war. He kept sort of ratcheting up the number of soldiers who had to go. And then Richard Nixon had obviously lied around everything with Watergate. And so the American public kind of in the wake of this, because it's also important that Johnson was a Democrat and Nixon was a Republican. And if you look at the 1964 election, where Johnson was reelected after he essentially took over after Kennedy's assassination, I mean, Johnson won in a huge landslide. The whole country went blue. Then you look at Richard Nixon's reelection just 8 years later in 1972, and it was a huge landslide. The whole country went red. So literally the whole country had kind of invested in Johnson. He failed. Then the whole country invested in Nixon, and then he failed. And in the wake of that, the country basically said, that's it. We're done with Washington. All of these people there are corrupt and gross. It doesn't matter what party they are. We want outsiders. And we started to look as a country toward outsiders. And originally what that meant was politicians outside of Washington, which translates to governors. So we pick Jimmy Carter, we pick Bill Clinton, we pick Ronald Reagan, we pick George W. Bush, all governors. And then what happens is that we start to get frustrated with the fact, especially in George W. Bush and Barack Obama's term, that these governors who are outsiders can't seem to solve the problems. We still have obstructionism. We still have divided government. These people promised to be uniters. They weren't. And the truth is, by the end of George W. Bush's term, only Republicans still liked him. And the truth is, by the end of Barack Obama's term, only Democrats liked him. We don't often sort of understand that what that meant was they turned off a substantial portion of the country. And in turning off both of the country, you know, these substantial kind of majorities of the country, we ended up in exactly where we were in 2016, where the country said, no way are we electing a woman that comes from a political dynasty. We're certainly not electing Jeb Bush, who comes from a different dynasty. And oh, by the way, governors are irrelevant too. Now we're like, as a country, saying we want somebody outside of politics altogether. And that's how we get Trump. Is this longer story of disillusionment and frustration with the fact that the politicians who are coming to Washington basically can't get it done. But I would also argue to the vast majority of people that part of the reason why they couldn't get it done is because they had no experience here, right? Like, how do you know where the bodies are buried, where the leverage points are, you know, what the rules and procedures and the norms are, if actually you've never been here? And I think the only reason why Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton succeeded, because they did, is that they had very long careers in politics, or they actually came to Washington. You know, Jimmy Carter did not have a long career, and neither did George W. Bush or Barack Obama. These were kind of political newbies. George H.W. Bush is really a different story, and I will tell you, when you read the story of him, what you actually realize is that by the time 92 came around, he was just kind of exhausted and done with politics. You know, he had been considered multiple times to be VP. He had been passed up. He eventually became Reagan's VP. He served 8 years in that role, and then he gets elected to his own term. And then he's very successfully sort of executes the first Gulf War. And really, by the time 92 comes around, he just figured he deserved a pass. He's like, okay, folks, I've done a lot. Can't you just see it? Why do I have to keep working for you? And that's partly how you get Ross Perot and this difference. You asked me, can we survive more outsiders with no political experience? I would say no. And I'll leave it there.
Oh, thanks.
But I should go back and talk a little bit about the different characters of Trump and Biden in terms of leadership style.
Yeah.
Because it is true that you can actually see very clearly that Trump only knows how to lead from strength. That's it. His belief is strength, 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 always strength. Never concede, never lead from empathy, never lead from curiosity, never lead from anything but essentially risk-taking, courage, and strength. Joe Biden is literally the complete polar opposite, right? He is, I would argue, the person who leads most often from compassion and from the heart. Truthfully, I think both of them have a problem in that they haven't typically led from a place of curiosity. Right? So I don't think either of them over the course of their lives have asked enough questions. And I would if we look back to sort of Biden's leadership on the Judiciary Committee with Anita Hill, now I would look back and say, what do you mean? He was trying to actually lead with some sense of compassion with his fellow Republicans who were on the committee. So what he was actually trying to do is kind of bridge the distance. You know, he was thinking about Arlen Specter. He was thinking about George H.W. Bush. He was thinking about this nomination. And he was thinking much more in terms of, how do I create a bipartisan compromise because that'll make everybody feel good? Then how do I ask more questions about a potential sexual harassment, which now would be taken much more seriously?
Yeah.
And Trump just doesn't ask questions, and he doesn't really care about the answers either.
Right.
See this with the coronavirus task force.
Right. Well, you just answered one question that came up. I want to, let's see, I'm going to, if you have questions, please either put them in the chat or in the Q&A. You can raise your hand, and I'll call on you. Nancy Dietz, I'm going to allow you to talk there, or you can unmute yourself, I think, maybe. Let's see. Oop. Can I unmute you?
Lara, that was me. That was me by mistake. I'm sorry, but Lara, it's so good to see you. This is fabulous.
It's wonderful to sort of see you, or at least hear you. And too long
I'm sorry.
since we've had a chance to see each other.
Lower hand.
No worries. What other questions do we have?
I mean, I'd be happy to, like I said, I can sort of talk about these different presidents in their different kind of temperaments. I mean,
Yeah.
I think anyone who goes back and studies Bill Clinton, right, it's really obvious that yes, he is sort of known for his empathy and compassion, but he's also known for his voracious curiosity. I mean, you know, this is a guy who, like, 3 o'clock in the morning, he was calling people and talking to them about, you know, what do we know about this new policy? Do we have a sense of how this would play out? You know, anyone, if you read any insider account from Clinton's presidency, almost all of them will talk about how they got 2 o'clock, 3 a.m. phone calls from him, not necessarily on urgent, you know, dire matters, on just the policies and the briefing books that he was reading and scouring through, and he had questions. And I would also argue, quite frankly, that's how we ended up in a situation with Monica Lewinsky. He was a little curious for his own good, right?
Right. Do you, just one question I have, actually. So I know it's hard to sort of think about this because we haven't had a woman, but do you think that any of the kind of leadership, like how leadership kind of manifests itself in women, would be the same if we had a woman? Like, is the kind of curiosity, compassion, and courage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will just say, part of the reason why I defined curiosity, like I defined leadership this way, being able to lead in 3 different dimensions, covers a wide range of strategies and tactics, is because I actually believe to the core of my being that leadership is not an inborn trait, that it actually comes in all packages. It's something that you learn. And when I think about these 3 traits, I think the thing that is so fascinating to me about them is that they are much more gender neutral than sort of this traditional understanding of leadership as only being strength. And I think that, you know, we shouldn't forget these things. You know, even like you can see, I have George Washington on my wall. Even as we think about somebody like George Washington, who was sort of known for his courage, right? He still had the wherewithal to learn how to lead with compassion. In fact, there's a very important moment in George Washington's tenure as basically general of the Continental Army, where the Continental Army is about to mutiny. And he comes in to give a speech, basically before all these officers who are ready to mutiny. And he very deliberately had a pair of reading glasses like in his pocket. And he basically says, you know, he makes this whole kind of show, like, forgive me while I, you know, put on my glasses. And he says, because I have lost like my youth and my eyesight in the fight for this country. Supposedly all of the officers pretty much like started crying. And it was because he was exposing how much he had given up, like what his frailties were at that moment. And that is very much leading with compassion. So I don't see this as like gendered. I actually see this as these 3 different dimensions in which we lead are really about understanding the moment that you're in and what is needed to move the people that you are hoping to move toward your direction. And I also think of courage, curiosity, and compassion very similar to the way I think of, you know, flight, right, fight, or freeze, which are considered to be 3 different dimensions in terms of how people handle survival.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of think about, like I said, these dimensions as being similar to that.
Mm.
And I think cover most of the range of actions, which then reveal who the person is.
Mm. So we've got a question, kind of somewhat related, about the role of the role of women, mothers or wives, in shaping the past presidents, like their roles and their characters.
Sure. I mean, I will tell you that in this book, I talk about their biographies, but I don't talk about their psychologies. But I'm somebody who's very psychologically knowledgeable, and I'm certainly adept at reading what some of these biographical facts may mean. So I will tell you that it is true that, right, like when you look at George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan, all of them had kind of closer relationships with their mothers than, in fact, some of the other presidents. And there are some really interesting moments. I mean, I will tell you, one of the most devastating biographical facts to me was that George W. Bush, he was actually in grade school when he found out that his sister died of leukemia. And he didn't know that his sister was sick with leukemia. Barbara Bush and George Bush Sr. had basically taken Robin, his sister, to New York to be treated, you know, in New York with sort of the best chemotherapy, the best care available. And basically George W. Bush was, you know, home with other family members in Texas. They were in Midland. He was in a grade school classroom. He was basically just finishing up his class, and his parents kind of like drove up in the car, and he thought he saw Robin in the back seat, you know, and he didn't. And then his mom basically comes out, and then they tell him that his sister died. Now, you can imagine what an unbelievably traumatic event that is for him. I stopped in my tracks when I then flashed forward to 9/11, realized that he was in a grade school classroom reading to children who was the age that he was when he learned of his sister's death, when he heard about 9/11. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I can't imagine the kind of like literally post-traumatic stress trauma that George W. Bush had in that moment.
Yeah.
And how difficult that must have been, because the surprise was so shocking in both instances.
Yeah.
And you know, and so I think this is what's really interesting about this. I mean, certainly Ronald Reagan, you know, his father was an alcoholic, and he carried his father like inside one night when he had collapsed on the doorstep. Many of our presidents have had very difficult upbringings. So that's not unusual. And if you asked me why, I actually think it's because of something that Alexander Hamilton wrote when he was 15 years of age, in his account of a hurricane on St. Croix. And if you guys have seen the musical Hamilton, you know that he was in a hurricane as a very young person, and he rode his way out of St. Croix. But in that account, he said, "My heart bleeds and I have no power to solace." And I think that's so powerful, because I really believe that most politicians have some place in them that is either personally wounded or their heart is bleeding in one capacity or another. And they deeply believe that if they gain power in politics, that they can sort of heal that wound in themselves, as they heal the country, as they heal what they see as the biggest problem. So I would argue for all of our interested students who are thinking about themselves as future politicians, I think the best way to make sure that you can really serve the country is work on healing yourself first before you give everything to the country. Because in fact, if you heal yourself first, you will be able to give more.
That's very true. I think in most careers, actually.
I think that's true. But I think there's like this fascinating relationship where politicians kind of project onto the collective their soul.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a few minutes left. Is there something, I'm trying to think of the presidents that you didn't talk about. Like, can you talk about sort of Carter and as another sort of his, I think he's fascinating in that when he was in office, he wasn't super popular, but now that he's, he's become this amazing humanitarian character and leader. And talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Carter is fascinating, partly because he leads with curiosity, first and foremost. He's not somebody who actually leads with his heart. Is a post-presidency evolution rather than a pre-presidency disposition. So he is somebody who, when you look at him as a young person, he very much led with kind of like facts and thinking and curiosity, and he was very detail oriented. And he was also, like I would argue that he took risks, but he liked to take risks where he could play out the kind of known factors. So the classic example, and again, this is where there are some strange parallels about how life mirrors the challenges that exist in the presidency for these presidents. As a young person, he basically volunteered to be in military service. He went to Annapolis. He wanted to be in the Navy. He went through the Navy and basically very quickly became part of the Navy's submarine unit. And he was really fascinated with submarines. And he also got promoted into working on nuclear submarines because that kind of fit his engineering disposition. He was fascinated by nuclear subs, and that was kind of cutting edge technology at the time. And it is also true that as a young person, there was an accident with a nuclear sub that he was part of basically the rescue team that had to go fix the reactor. And they could literally only be down like for 90 seconds to fix the reactor. It was a very detailed process. Now, like I said, this was incredibly risky. You absolutely could die. But I think when you look at him, he loved this because it wasn't just like he was jumping out of a plane. He knew step A, B, C, D, E, F, right, to solve the problem. And he really liked that knowable solution. And this is where, like I said, life is very strange. When he was president, we had the only nuclear meltdown of a massive reactor in the United States, 3 Mile Island. It was also the case that we didn't have Chernobyl because Jimmy Carter knew exactly how to fix nuclear reactors, right? So he sort of knew what to do. And because he knew what to do, he also helped manage the kind of recovery at 3 Mile Island. He also was not fearful about going up to Pennsylvania and touring the site because he knew exactly where the risks were and where they weren't. And so this is where, like I said, kind of life has this fascinating mirror tendency to the challenges we face and the characters that we are.
That's great. Well, we're gonna have to wrap it up there. If you have any final thoughts that you want to share about.
Well, I mean, I'll just share that I do think that our biggest problem in the modern presidency is actually a problem of authenticity. And by that, what I mean is that presidents only know how to be who they are. They do not have the flexibility or the skill set to learn leadership in these other dimensions. Part of the problem that we have is that we keep having these presidents applying the same essentially leadership strategy to every problem. And that's just not going to work. I mean, right, there's that old phrase about, you know, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you know, every problem looks like a nail. So what we really need is we need our politicians to actually be more skilled at understanding how to act or how to portray these other leadership dimensions if they are not comfortable to themselves. And I think that that's the growth and work of anyone who wants to be a leader. You know, how do you be better than who you are? Not just how do you be exactly who you are? Because not all of who you are is great. And I think we've come to accept this idea that authentically awful is perfectly fine. And it's not fine. You should try to be better than who you are. And that means every day you work on yourself and you say, how do I become a better person? How do I be a leader? How do I learn things that I don't know or are not comfortable to me? And I really think that's the work of leadership. And that's what our former politicians used to do. But then we had all these people say, oh, well, they're just acting. They're not really like that. They're not authentic enough. So now we've come to accept this sort of authenticity in all of its ugliness.
Right.
Well as the fact that sometimes that may actually help on a leadership dimension. I mean, I think I'll just say, kind of in closing on this, you know, I conclude my book by basically saying it's really not a problem for leaders to be actors. In fact, part of the job of leadership is acting. You have to understand what the role demands, and then you have to learn how to be that character. Our problem most recently is that our most recent presidents are really celebrities, not actors. Celebrities are not people who act, they just people who are, right? So we don't care what Kim Kardashian does. We just watch her, whatever she does, and it's all fine because she's a celebrity.
Right.
We've come to accept kind of that standard in our politicians as though that is okay. But the truth is we are kind of trading spectacle and celebrity for leadership and actors.
That's a really good point. I think authentically awful. That's that's great.
I mean, you know, and like I said, if you read the book, what you'll see is that my book is fairly harsh on, you know, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, obviously. Donald Trump is a whole separate level of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. But I don't think that we can walk away and say that George W. Bush or Barack Obama were successful leaders. They both had opportunities that Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton did not have, because in fact, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton's presidencies were in some way less crisis filled. And yet, you know, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton were better leaders. And I think this is where crisis doesn't change the character of somebody, it reveals their character and shows their failings. So like I said, when I look at sort of what the crisis was of 9/11 or the war on terror, I find George W. Bush wanting. Look at the crisis of the Great Recession and the economic trough through which America was in, and I look at Barack Obama's leadership, I find his leadership wanting. I think on those two massive crises, we have seen presidents not do all that they could have done had they had kind of better, more well-rounded, more politically experienced characters. And then you look at Donald Trump, and let's face it, I mean, I think there's a failure on the pandemic, there's a failure on the economics, there's a failure on the moral dimension. There are so many failures that it's actually even difficult to put him anywhere in the scale.
Interesting. Well,
So,
Lara, thank you so much. If anyone on the phone would, or on the phone would like to purchase the book, it should be in your email, the email invitation you got, and I know it's on Amazon, and you can use the Amazon Smile account and have fun, get a little bit of your money. Thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to vote. Whoever you're going to vote for, voting is important, and it's important to show the way voice your opinion about our democracy. So
absolutely. And Sarah, I can't thank you enough. And it's a delight. And if anyone has any questions, they're always, feel free to reach out to me. My email's in your inbox, I think. So
thanks, Lara.
To connect.